This is Michael Jenks from Interpres. Thank you for taking a look at what we've been working on. We're all about optimizing your defenses against the threats that matter most. We want to help organizations understand their threat exposure risk against trending adversarial activity that would target an organization fitting their threat profile. By threat profile, we mean industry vertical association, size of the organization, geolocation of operations, types of data you protect, etc. The scope of today's recording is to further dive into enhanced asset tagging capabilities that the platform provides. So assets are very important, and having an understanding of them, of live assets within the environment, because they provide a lot of exposure risk, depending on the vulnerabilities that are associated with those particular assets. So the way Interpres goes about identifying assets within a customer environment is essentially we provide CASM, cyber asset attack surface management type of capabilities with the tool sets that you already have. So we integrate via read-only API to all of your security tools, specifically things like vulnerability scanners. From the aspect of vulnerability scanners, we want to connect to everything that you have, whether that's coming from the endpoint, the cloud, or a traditional scanner like Tenable. From those solutions, we would start building out our understanding of live assets within the environment and the associated vulnerabilities. We would also continue building out our understanding of live assets within the environment with all of the other security tools that we connect to. So for instance, a SIEM like Microsoft Sentinel, Splunk, Elastic, Chronicle, etc. We are essentially passively identifying, again, those assets for any asset that those particular tool sets are observing. So some things we can do with assets and understanding of them is, again, marrying that with trending adversarial activity that allows you instantaneously to understand if you have exposure risk against that trending adversarial activity. So you can see here, there was an advisory that was put out by Symantec with regard to Ransom Hub. Pivoting into this particular campaign, we would provide understanding of what industry verticals it's targeting, geolocations, provide reference to that advisory itself. But as you can see here, from a vulnerability perspective, we're able to allow you to understand if you have any asset exposure to that trending adversarial campaign. You can see here that we've identified that there are 9 assets that have this particular vulnerability within the environment. Upon clicking into that particular asset view with regard to this vulnerability, you can see the 9 assets that have that particular CVE exposure. Beyond that, you can see that there are actually 9 other adversarial campaigns that are leveraging this particular CVE. So very important from a patching prioritization perspective of understanding who's targeting you, understand what CVEs they're leveraging to, again, prioritize patching efforts and drive down that overall exposure risk. We would also provide, pivoting into an overarching vulnerability list, since we connect to all of the vuln scanners and identify all of the assets via the tooling that you already have within the environment, we would provide an overarching list from the endpoint to the cloud of all of the CVEs that are present within the environment, allowing you to prioritize patching efforts from a threat-centric perspective. So you can see this top CVE here, we are saying that this is something you need to worry about and you should prioritize patching efforts. Into our analysis, we're taking into account things like EPSS scores, CVSS scores. Also, has it been exploited in the wild? But most importantly, there are 5 active campaigns that are leveraging this particular vulnerability that would target an organization like yours. You have 7 assets that have this exposure to prioritize patching efforts to drive down that overall exposure list. We also create an asset inventory, again, leveraging the tools that you already have. This asset inventory is very powerful because of the tagging capabilities that we implement. So pivoting into the asset-specific view, you can see that this particular asset was identified by Qualys, which is a vulnerability scanner, Microsoft Sentinel, which is a SIEM. Interpres automatically tagged this particular endpoint as having no endpoint detection or response capability. Because again, it was picked up by a vulnerability scanner and the SIEM, but not the EDR. Thus, action item, deploy an EDR to this particular host to get the defensive readiness capabilities up. Why? Well, again, from an exposure perspective, this particular asset has a critical vulnerability, which was known to be exploited. So if that were to be exploited, there's little chance of mitigating or remediating that particular exploitation because there is no EDR deployed to this host. Interpres also has the ability to ingest tagging from other tool sets, whether that be your vulnerability scanner, your CMDB, or the EDR itself. We also have the ability to manually tag items as well. So user-defined tagging, we'd be able to do that on the fly. And where that comes into importance is going back to the overarching asset inventory list, being able to target subsets of assets of interest. So going back to, let's say, crown jewels or user-defined, and filtering with that tag, you can see here, these are 5 assets that are defined by the user as crown jewels. And I can very quickly identify that these assets have a bunch of vulnerabilities. But again, picked up by Microsoft Sentinel and Qualys, meaning that they do not have an EDR deployed. So action item, let's go deploy that EDR. Another example would be assets that were identified by something other than the vulnerability scanner. So you can see here, we have a system generated tag for no vulnerability scanner integration. So filtering by that particular tag, you can see that these assets were identified by the SIEM, but not the vulnerability scanner. So that means that these assets most likely have a bunch of vulnerabilities that this organization does not have insight into. Thus, it's unaccounted for exposure. So action item here would be to put these particular assets within the scanning range of the vulnerability scanners, right, to get an understanding of the exposure risk that they present to the organization. So in review, Interpres, we're all about optimizing your defenses against the threats that matter most. A component of understanding that readiness and exposure is asset and vulnerability perspectives. And we want to marry that with trending adversarial activity. So we want to also allow organizations to measure improvement or degradation over time. You can see here from the main dashboard that we're measuring key aspects of vulnerability exposure. So assets with known exploited vulnerabilities, we want to see this number going down over time. It's a critical exposure that we want to reduce that attack surface and increase defensive readiness. We also want to see vulnerabilities that are being actively leveraged in campaigns. We want to see that number going down as well. Thank you for your time and have a great day.